The Monroe County Sheriff's Office in Florida keeps a filing cabinet in their basement that nobody opens anymore. Inside are incident reports from 1,857, documenting 7 separate search parties that entered the Everglades, pursuing the same target, a black girl estimated to be 16 years old who'd been living alone in the swamp for nearly 3 years. 23 men went into that wilderness tracking her. Not one of them came back alive. The official records attribute their deaths to alligators, disease, and the hostile environment of the Florida wetlands. But testimony from Seminole guides who refused to continue after the first week tells a different story. They described a presence in the swamp that moved like water, that knew every channel and hammock and killing ground, that watched from places human beings shouldn't be able to reach. They called her the one who walks between, and they insisted that the white men hadn't died from natural causes. They'd been led to their deaths, step by step, by someone who understood that the Everglades didn't need to be fought. It only needed to be guided. The truth about what happened when 23 armed men pursued a girl who'd made the swamp her home has been deliberately obscured, but the evidence exists in fragments. In testimony dismissed as superstition, in bodies found in impossible locations, in the fact that after 1857, Monroe County stopped organizing search parties into the deep Everglades entirely, and local slave catchers began refusing contracts that required entering the wetlands south of the settlement line. Something in those swamps had demonstrated that predators could become prey, and the lesson was taught so thoroughly that it changed how an entire region understood power. Before we dive deeper into this disturbing historical mystery, if stories like this fascinate you, the kind of buried American history that challenges everything we thought we knew about survival and resistance, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you never miss these dark narratives. I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. Now let's discover what really happened when 23 men made the fatal mistake of believing weapons were stronger than knowledge and numbers were more powerful than belonging. The Florida Everglades, in the 1,850 seconds, were unlike any other wilderness in America. A vast river of grass flowing imperceptibly south, creating a landscape that seemed flat and open but concealed thousands of deadly secrets beneath its surface. Water that looked inches deep could drop to 10 feet without warning. Sawgrass sharp enough to slice through leather grew so dense it was impenetrable. Alligators reached lengths of 14 feet and hunted with patience learned over millions of years of evolution. Cottonmouth snakes congregated in numbers that made certain areas impassable, and the heat and humidity created conditions where a body could decompose completely in less than a week, leaving almost nothing for searchers to find. The Seminole people had lived in this environment for generations, developing intimate knowledge of how to survive in conditions that killed outsiders within days. They knew which hammocks, the islands of solid ground rising from the water, offered fresh water and which were poisoned by salt intrusion. They understood the seasonal patterns of flooding, the migration routes of game animals, the locations of dangerous predators. This knowledge was survival, passed down through families, taught to children from the moment they could walk. Without it, the Everglades were a death trap. With it, they became home. After the Second Seminole War ended in 1842, most of the indigenous population had been forcibly removed to Oklahoma Territory, but some had retreated deeper into the Everglades, where American soldiers refused to follow. These holdouts maintained small communities in the most inaccessible regions, living in ways that had sustained their ancestors for centuries. They traded occasionally with settlers on the coast, selling hides and gator skins, but otherwise avoided contact with white civilization that had already stolen everything it could reach. Among the refugees living on the Everglades fringe in 1854 was a girl named Sarah, though that wasn't the name her mother had given her. Her mother had been enslaved on a plantation in northern Florida, had escaped during the chaos of the Seminole Wars, and had been taken in by a small band of Seminole who recognized her desperation. The band had included 3 families, 14 people total, trying to survive in territory so remote that American authority hadn't bothered establishing presence. Sarah's mother had learned their language, adopted their survival techniques, married a man from one of the families, and given birth to Sarah in 1,838 inches, a shiki built over water, the traditional Seminole dwelling that allowed air circulation in brutal heat. Sarah grew up between worlds. Her mother taught her the field songs and stories of enslaved people in the Carolinas and Georgia, keeping alive memories of a culture that slavery tried to destroy. Her father and the other Seminole taught her to read the swamp, to move silently through sawgrass, to fish and hunt and identify the thousands of plants that either sustained life or ended it. By age 10, she could navigate the Everglades better than guides who'd worked the territory for decades. By 12, she could survive alone for weeks, with nothing but a knife. By 14, she knew things about the wetlands that even her Seminole family found remarkable. She had an intuitive understanding of how the ecosystem functioned, how every element connected to every other element, how to predict what the swamp would do before it did it. In the spring of 1854, Sarah's community was discovered by a surveying team working for railroad interests that wanted to map potential routes through South Florida. The surveyors reported finding Indians to the territorial government, and within 2 weeks, a militia unit arrived with orders to remove the holdouts to the reservation or kill them if they resisted. The Seminole families saw the militia coming from miles away. The way groups of armed white men moved through the Everglades announced their presence like thunder. They scattered, each family taking different directions, planning to regroup at a predetermined location weeks later. Sarah's family headed south into the deepest part of the swamp where the militia's horses couldn't follow and most men's courage failed. The militia pursued for 3 days before giving up on Sarah's family, but on the 3rd day, they encountered another problem. One of their members, a young soldier named Thomas Webb, had developed fever from drinking contaminated water. His condition deteriorated rapidly, and the commanding officer made the decision to return to the settlement rather than watch Webb die in the swamp. As they were preparing to carry Webb out, Sarah's father made a choice that would doom his family. He approached the militia camp alone, unarmed, and offered to guide them back to navigable waterways if they would leave his family in peace. It was an act of mercy toward men who didn't deserve it, and it cost him everything. The militia commander agreed to the terms, let Sarah's father guide them to safety, then had him shot in the back once they reached the settlement. Killed him because leaving a witness felt dangerous, because promises made to Indians meant nothing, because cruelty was easier than honor. They threw his body into a canal where alligators took it before sunrise. When Sarah's father didn't return after a week, her mother knew what had happened. The knowing settled into her like poison. The certainty that the man she'd built a life with had been murdered by people he'd tried to help. The grief and rage transformed her. She'd survived slavery, escaped to freedom, built a family in one of the harshest environments on Earth, and now she'd lost her partner to the same violence she'd spent 20 years running from. Something broke inside her, or perhaps something hardened beyond breaking. 3 weeks after her father's death, Sarah's mother walked into the swamp alone. She told Sarah she was going to hunt, but she took no weapons, no supplies, just walked into the sawgrass and didn't come back. Sarah searched for 5 days, covering territory she knew her mother frequented, checking every hammock and waterway and fishing spot. She found nothing. The Everglades had claimed her mother completely, whether through choice or accident Sarah would never know. At 16 years old, Sarah was alone in a wilderness that killed experienced survivors regularly, with no community, no family, no support system, and nowhere else to go. The settlement meant slavery or death. The Seminole families her parents had lived with had scattered, and she didn't know how to find them. The only option was to survive here, in the Everglades that had raised her, using every skill she'd learned in 16 years of living between worlds. For 6 months, Sarah lived in complete isolation. She built a shickie on a hammock she'd discovered years earlier, a place so remote and accessed through channels so narrow that even Seminole hunters rarely went there. She fished with traps woven from palmetto fronds. She hunted birds and small game with a bow she'd constructed from cypress wood. She collected rainwater and knew which springs provided fresh water year-round. The solitude was crushing at first, the absence of voices and touch and shared meals, but gradually she adapted. The swamp became her companion in ways it had never been when other people surrounded her. She learned to read its moods, to sense weather changes hours before they arrived, to predict animal behavior with accuracy that felt almost supernatural but was actually just accumulated observation. In December of 1854, Sarah made a mistake that would change everything. She'd been checking fish traps near the settlement fringe, farther north than she usually ventured, when she saw smoke from a campfire. Curiosity overcame caution. She approached silently, moving through sawgrass without disturbing it, and observed the camp from concealment. It was a group of 5 men, rough-looking, armed with rifles and machetes, sitting around a fire cooking fish they'd caught with expensive tackle. Their conversation carried clearly across the water, and what Sarah heard made her blood freeze. They were slave catchers working on commission, tracking runaways who'd reportedly fled into the Everglades. They had descriptions of 3 men and 2 women, rewards totaling $3,000, and they were planning to search the deep swamp systematically until they found their targets or confirmed them dead. Sarah had started to retreat, to disappear before they noticed her, when one of the men stood and looked directly at where she was hiding. He couldn't have seen her. The sawgrass concealment was perfect, but his gaze lingered in her direction with an intensity that suggested intuition. She remained absolutely still, barely breathing, while he studied the area. After what felt like hours but was probably 30 seconds, he sat back down and resumed eating. Sarah waited until full darkness before moving, then retreated to her hammock with new understanding of how vulnerable she really was. These men were professionals. They knew how to track people who didn't want to be found, and if they worked the area long enough, they would eventually discover evidence of her presence. A fish trap, a trail through the sawgrass, something that would tell them someone was living out here. She had 2 choices: abandon her hammock and move deeper south into territory so remote even she had never fully explored it, or stay and risk eventual discovery. But there was a third option, one that crystallized in her mind as she sat in darkness, listening to the Everglades breathe around her. These men were hunting people who'd done nothing wrong except refuse to be property. They were violence given purpose, and they would keep coming, keep searching, keep destroying until someone stopped them. Sarah thought about her mother walking into the swamp to die, about her father shot in the back after offering mercy, about the Seminole families scattered and hunted, about the fundamental wrongness of a world where survival meant hiding forever from people who claimed the right to own you. The third option was to make them afraid to come here, to teach them that the Everglades belonged to people who understood it, and intruders paid prices they couldn't imagine. She would become what they feared most, not a runaway hiding and hoping, but a force that actively hunted them back. She would use everything her father and the Seminole had taught her, every advantage the swamp provided, every mistake outsiders made, and she would show them that predators could become prey when they entered territory they didn't comprehend. Sarah began to prepare. The first slave catcher disappeared on January 9th, 1855. His name was Marcus Dill, and he'd separated from his group to check a channel that looked promising for hiding places. He was experienced, had worked Florida and Georgia for 8 years, recovered dozens of runaways. He carried a rifle, a pistol, a machete, and a compass. When he didn't return by nightfall, his companions assumed he'd gotten disoriented and would find his way back by morning. When morning came with no sign of him, they began searching. They found his campsite from the previous week, his equipment scattered deliberately across the ground. His rifle lay in shallow water, unloaded, the ammunition arranged in a circle around it like some kind of ritual marker. His machete was embedded point first in a cypress tree at head height, and his compass hung from a branch, spinning uselessly because something had been done to it. The needle bent, or the mechanism damaged, so it pointed in random directions. What they didn't find was Marcus Dill. No body, no blood, no signs of struggle. Just his possessions arranged in ways that suggested someone had taken time to make a statement. The remaining 4 slave catchers spent 3 days searching before retreating to the settlement to report the disappearance. They told the sheriff that Dill had probably fallen into deep water and been taken by an alligator, though they couldn't explain why an alligator would have carefully arranged his equipment first. The sheriff accepted the explanation because the alternative, that someone in the Everglades was actively hunting slave catchers, was too disturbing to acknowledge. Marcus Dill's body was found 6 weeks later by Seminole traders, 3 miles from where his equipment had been discovered. He was wedged into a crevice in a limestone outcropping, positioned in a way that suggested he'd been alive when placed there, but unable to escape. The space was too narrow for his shoulders, but wide enough that he hadn't suffocated immediately. He'd died slowly, trapped in stone, probably from dehydration and exposure. The Seminole who found him reported the discovery to the sheriff, but refused to answer questions about how a grown man could have been forced into a space barely large enough for a child. They simply stated that the deep Everglades was not safe for white men, that something there was angry, and that more deaths would follow if people kept coming. The sheriff organized a proper search party in March of 1855. 10 men, all experienced in wilderness tracking, all armed and supplied for 2 weeks in the swamp. They carried detailed maps that surveyors had made, camping equipment designed for wet conditions, and enough ammunition to fight a small war. The goal was to locate any runaway communities in the deep Everglades, recover fugitives if possible, and investigate what had happened to Marcus Dill. The commanding officer was a man named Jacob Sterling, a former military officer who'd fought in the Second Seminole War and believed he understood the territory better than most. Sterling's search party entered the Everglades on March 12th, moving south along established waterways, camping on known hammocks, proceeding with military discipline. For the first 3 days, everything went according to plan. They covered significant distance, found no evidence of human habitation, and maintained good morale. On the 4th day, they began to notice they were being followed. Nothing obvious, just small signs that someone was tracking their movement. Bent sawgrass that sprang back after they passed, suggesting something had moved through recently. Ripples in water that didn't match wind patterns. The sense of being watched, that soldiers learned to trust. The intuition that hostile eyes were observing from concealment. Sterling posted guards that night, 2 men awake at all times, rifles loaded and ready. But the attack, when it came, wasn't what they expected. Around midnight, one of the guards, a man named Peters, started screaming. The camp exploded into chaos, everyone grabbing weapons, trying to identify the threat in darkness, broken only by firelight. When they finally got Peters calmed enough to speak, his story made no sense. He insisted something had crawled over his legs, something large and cold that moved with deliberate slowness. But when he'd looked down, nothing was there. The other guard, positioned 10 feet away, swore he'd been watching Peters the entire time and had seen nothing approach him. They dismissed it as nerves, exhaustion, playing tricks on perception, and resumed their watch. But over the next 2 hours, 3 more men reported similar experiences. Something touching them that vanished when observed directly. Pressure on shoulders, tugging on clothes, once a sensation like fingers running through hair. Each time, other guards insisted they'd been watching and had seen nothing. The psychological impact was immediate and severe. Being touched by something invisible was worse than being attacked openly. It suggested they were dealing with something beyond normal experience, something that operated by rules they didn't understand. Morning revealed the source of the night's terror and made it worse. Tracks surrounded their camp, human footprints in mud, bare feet, small enough to be a woman or young person. The tracks circled their position repeatedly, sometimes coming within 3 feet of where men had been sleeping, then retreating into the sawgrass. But the pattern was wrong. The tracks appeared and disappeared at random, not following logical paths. They'd emerge from water too deep to wade through, cross solid ground, then vanish at the edge of visibility. It was as though whoever made them could walk on water, or chose when to leave prints and when to move without leaving any trace. Sterling studied the tracks with growing unease. He'd tracked Seminole warriors during the war, knew how indigenous fighters moved through this terrain, and these tracks were different. They showed someone moving with complete confidence, approaching armed men without apparent concern, demonstrating that she and the track size suggested female could reach them whenever she wanted. The touchings during the night hadn't been supernatural. They'd been a woman moving among them in darkness with such skill that even alert guards hadn't detected her until she chose to be felt. 2 men asked to return to the settlement that morning. Sterling refused, pointing out that they had a mission to complete, and retreating after one unsettling night would make them laughingstock. The men stayed, but their enthusiasm was gone, replaced by watchful fear that made them jump at bird calls and stare into the sawgrass as though expecting attack at any moment. They broke camp and continued south, but cohesion was already fracturing. The group that had entered the Everglades with military discipline was becoming a collection of frightened individuals who happened to be traveling together. That afternoon, they found the first message. Carved into a cypress tree at the waterline were symbols none of them recognized. Not English letters, not Seminole markings they'd seen during the war, something else entirely. The carving was fresh, made within the past few hours based on the sap still weeping from the cuts. Below the symbols, at the tree's base, was an arrangement that made several men want to vomit. Animal bones, small creatures, birds and rodents, arranged in a pattern that might have been decorative or might have held meaning they couldn't interpret. And in the center of the bone arrangement was a piece of cloth torn from Peters's shirt, the man who'd screamed first the previous night. He insisted his shirt was intact, but when they checked, there was a strip missing from the back hem that he hadn't noticed being taken. Sterling ordered them to keep moving, to not let psychological warfare slow their progress, but his authority was weakening with every strange discovery. By evening, they'd found 3 more trees bearing symbols, each accompanied by bone arrangements that grew more elaborate. The final one included a human skull, old and weathered, that might have been from the burial site of Seminole ancestors, or might have been something else entirely. One of the men, a tracker named Williams, who'd been particularly confident 3 days ago, stated flatly that he was done. He would return to the settlement with or without the group. He would risk traveling alone rather than stay another night in territory where something was deliberately terrorizing them. Sterling pulled his pistol and told Williams that desertion during an official expedition would result in criminal charges. Williams stared at him with hollow eyes and said something that would be remembered and repeated for years afterward. "Charge me if I live long enough to reach a courthouse. I'll take my chances with the law over whatever's out here collecting pieces of us." He walked north into the sawgrass without supplies or weapons, simply started walking and didn't look back. Sterling let him go, understanding that shooting one of his own men would complete the morale collapse that was already underway. They made camp that night on a hammock barely large enough for the 9 remaining men, huddled together in a space that felt more like a trap than shelter. They built the fire larger than necessary, wasting fuel to push back darkness that seemed to press in from all sides. Guards were posted in rotation, but nobody slept. They sat with rifles across their laps, watching the perimeter, starting at every sound the Everglades produced. And the sounds were constant and wrong. Normal swamp noises, frogs and insects and water movement, but also things that didn't fit. Splashing that suggested something large, moving through the channels around their hammock. Whistling that might have been wind through the sawgrass, or might have been someone mimicking bird calls with subtle variations that set teeth on edge. And voices, or what sounded like voices, whispering in languages they didn't understand, carrying across the water from no identifiable direction. Around midnight, they heard Williams screaming. The sound came from the north, from the direction he'd walked hours earlier, close enough that they could hear the words. He was begging, not for mercy from a person but from the swamp itself, pleading with the Everglades to let him go, promising he'd never come back if he could just reach the settlement. His screams went on for what felt like hours, but was probably minutes, then stopped with the kind of abruptness that suggested his voice had been cut off, rather than fading naturally. No one spoke about what they'd heard. They sat in silence, understanding that Williams was dead, that retreating alone was apparently not safer than staying with the group, that whatever was out here could reach them regardless of their decisions. Sterling's face showed no emotion in the firelight, but his hands shook when he tried to light his pipe. The other men watched their surroundings with the glazed expressions of people pushed beyond normal fear into a state where the mind simply stops processing horror as anything unusual. Dawn brought no relief. They found William's body 50 yards from their camp, floating face down in shallow water. His back bore scratches that formed patterns, deliberate marks that couldn't have been accidental. The scratches looked like the symbols they'd seen carved in trees, as though someone had used him as a canvas to write a message in a language they couldn't read. His eyes were open, his face locked in an expression of such complete terror that 2 of the remaining men vomited when they saw it. He died within shouting distance of the camp, and none of them had considered trying to help him because they'd all understood instinctively that going into the darkness meant joining him in death. Sterling made the decision to abort the expedition. They would return to the settlement immediately, traveling together, moving as quickly as the terrain allowed. But when they tried to retrace their route, they discovered that the channels they'd used to travel south had changed. 4 days ago were now blocked by sawgrass, so dense it seemed impenetrable. Hammocks they'd camped on were now underwater, submerged by seasonal flooding that shouldn't have happened so quickly. The maps the surveyors had made were useless because the landscape they depicted no longer matched reality. They were lost, 8 men with military training and expensive equipment, disoriented in a wilderness that shifted around them like something alive. And somewhere in that wilderness was someone who knew exactly where they were, who'd been tracking them since they entered the Everglades, who understood how to use the terrain as a weapon in ways they couldn't begin to comprehend. Someone who'd gone from being hunted to being the hunter, and was demonstrating with terrifying clarity that she had no intention of letting them leave alive. For 2 days, Sterling's group wandered through the Everglades trying to find routes north that remained passable. They'd moved for hours in what they believed was the right direction, only to encounter water too deep to cross or sawgrass walls that tore through their clothing and skin when they tried to push through. Each obstacle forced them to backtrack and try alternate routes, burning energy and supplies while making no real progress towards safety. The terrain was conspiring against them in ways that seemed almost intentional, as though someone who knew the seasonal patterns and water flows was deliberately guiding them into dead ends. On the 3rd day of attempted escape, they found evidence that confirmed their worst suspicions. On a hammock they'd been forced to use as a rest point, they discovered a cache hidden beneath palmetto fronds. Inside were supplies that had belonged to Marcus Dill, the first slave catcher who disappeared in January. His knife, his tobacco pouch, a journal he'd kept with daily entries that ended abruptly on January 9th. But mixed with Dill's possessions were items from their own group, a canteen belonging to Peters, an ammunition pouch that had gone missing from one of the boats 2 days earlier, a shirt that had been stolen from their camp the first night. The items were arranged carefully, almost reverently, and the message was clear. She'd been collecting from them since before they even knew she existed, had been planning this for months, preparing for the moment when more men would come looking for Dill, and she'd have the opportunity to demonstrate what happened to people who hunted in her territory. Beneath the arranged items was something more disturbing, a map, hand-drawn on bark, showing the Everglades in detail that rivaled professional surveys. The map, marked hammocks, channels, seasonal flooding patterns, places where water was too deep, areas where alligators congregated, and marked in charcoal were their movements over the past 6 days. Every camp they'd made, every wrong turn they'd taken, every backtrack forced by impassable terrain. The map showed they'd been traveling in a gradually tightening spiral, moving in patterns that felt like progress, but actually kept them contained in a relatively small area. She'd been herding them like livestock, using their own desperation to escape to guide them exactly where she wanted them. Sterling studied the map with the expression of a man watching his entire worldview collapse. He was a military officer, trained in tactics and strategy, accustomed to being the predator in any wilderness scenario. But this map proved he'd been outmaneuvered from the start by someone who understood the terrain so intimately that she could predict his decisions before he made them, could use his training against him, knowing that military thinking would lead to certain choices that she could exploit. He'd believed they were hunting a runaway girl. They were actually prey being systematically driven towards some conclusion she'd already planned. "We need to stop moving," said one of the men, a tracker named Coleman who'd been studying the map with growing horror. "Every time we try to escape, we go where she wants. We're giving her control by reacting. We should fortify one position and wait for a rescue party." Sterling considered this, recognized the logic, but also understood the problem. A rescue party would take weeks to organize and would have no idea where to search. The Everglades covered thousands of square miles. They could wait in place and run out of supplies before anyone found them, slowly starving while she watched from the sawgrass. But Coleman's suggestion had merit. Movement was clearly playing into her strategy, so staying still might disrupt whatever she'd planned. Sterling ordered them to make permanent camp on the largest hammock in the area, a piece of solid ground, maybe 40 yards across, with clear sightlines in all directions. They would ration their supplies, post constant watch, and survive long enough for rescue or for her to make a mistake they could exploit. It was defensive thinking born of desperation, but it was the only strategy left that didn't involve walking exactly where she wanted them to go. They spent the afternoon reinforcing their position, cut down sawgrass around the hammock's perimeter to improve visibility, set up shelters using their canvas tarps, organized their remaining ammunition and weapons for easy access, posted guards in 4 directions with overlapping fields of vision so nothing could approach unobserved. By nightfall, they'd created as defensible a position as the terrain allowed, and for the first time in days, some of the men showed something other than terror. They had a plan, they had structure, and maybe, just maybe, they could outlast whatever was out here. The attack began at sunset with fire, not their fire, but blazes that appeared in the sawgrass around their hammock, dozens of small fires that sprang up simultaneously in a rough circle. The fires were too coordinated to be natural, and too numerous to be the work of one person acting in the moment. She'd spent hours placing accelerants, dried grass and palm fronds soaked in plant oils, positioning them in patterns calculated to create maximum psychological impact. The fires didn't threaten their hammock directly, the vegetation was too wet to sustain spreading flames, but they created a ring of light that illuminated the sawgrass around them while leaving everything beyond in deeper darkness. Between the fires, they saw her for the first time clearly. A girl, barely more than a silhouette, standing motionless in the sawgrass just beyond the firelight's reach. She wore clothes made from hides and plant fibers, her hair pulled back with strips of leather, her face marked with patterns they couldn't distinguish at this distance. She held no weapons they could see, made no threatening gestures, just stood there watching them with an intensity they could feel even across 40 yards of swamp. Then she moved, vanishing into darkness so quickly it was as though she'd never been there, and a moment later appeared in a different location, still just beyond clear visibility, still watching. Over the next hour, she appeared and disappeared around their perimeter, never staying visible long enough for anyone to aim properly, never in the same location twice. She was demonstrating mobility they couldn't match, proving that their defensive position was an illusion. The fires eventually burned out, plunging the area back into darkness that felt even more oppressive after the temporary illumination, and they were left listening to sounds that might have been her moving through water, or might have been alligators drawn by the heat and light. "She's alone," Sterling said, trying to inject certainty into words that sounded hollow. "One person can't attack 8 armed men directly. She's trying to frighten us, break our discipline, make us do something stupid. If we maintain position and stay alert, she can't harm us." But even as he spoke, he knew the logic was flawed. She didn't need to attack them directly. The Everglades would do that work. Mosquitoes were already swarming, drawn by their fire and body heat, biting exposed skin in numbers that made sleep impossible. Their water supply was contaminated. They'd been drinking swamp water for days, and several men were showing signs of illness. Fever, stomach cramps, the beginning of dysentery that would dehydrate them faster than the heat already was. Time was not their ally. Around midnight, Peters started laughing. Not the laughter of humor, but the high-pitched, uncontrolled sound of someone whose mind had finally broken under sustained pressure. He stood up, walked to the edge of their hammock, and started shouting into the darkness. "You want us, come get us, stop hiding and fight like a soldier." The other men tried to pull him back, to quiet him before he gave away more of their positions than the fires already had, but Peters shoved them away with surprising strength. "I see you," he screamed at the sawgrass. "I know you're right there. I'm not afraid of you." What happened next occurred too fast for anyone to properly process. Something flew from the darkness, a blur of motion, and struck Peters in the shoulder. He staggered backward, clutching at the impact site, and when he pulled his hand away, it was covered in blood. Embedded in his shoulder was an arrow, primitive construction, cypress wood shaft and stone point, but driven deep enough to be immediately incapacitating. Peters collapsed, screaming now in pain rather than defiance, while the others dragged him back to the camp center and tried to stop the bleeding. The arrow itself was a message more powerful than any words. She'd struck from darkness, from a distance they couldn't determine, with accuracy that proved she could have killed Peters if she'd aimed for his chest or throat. She was showing them the same thing she'd shown with every action since they entered the Everglades. Their lives continued only because she permitted it. She was choosing to wound rather than kill, to terrorize rather than slaughter, because teaching them fear was more important than simple murder. Dead men couldn't carry warnings. Broken men could. Sterling pulled the arrow from Peters's shoulder, and the wounded man's screams echoed across the swamp, answered by sounds that might have been alligators or might have been something else. They bandaged the wound with strips torn from their shirts, but infection in this environment was almost guaranteed. Peters would develop fever within days, and without proper medical treatment, the wound would likely kill him. He'd become a burden, someone who needed constant care and couldn't contribute to their defense, exactly the kind of liability that destroyed group cohesion. Dawn revealed that during the night, while they'd been distracted with Peter's wound and watching for another attack, she'd been in their camp again. Small items were missing. A knife, a compass, someone's boots, but more disturbing were the things she'd left behind. Woven into their supplies were figures made from sawgrass, little human shapes, crude but recognizable. 8 figures when she started. Now only 7 remained, and one of those 7 had a red stain on it, marking Peters and his injury. The symbolism was impossible to miss. She was keeping count, marking them off as they fell, and the remaining figures represented choices she hadn't yet made. "We can't stay here," Coleman said flatly. "She's proven she can reach us whenever she wants. Defending this position is suicide." Sterling argued they had no better options, that moving meant more disorientation and exhaustion, but his authority was gone. The men were looking at each other with the expressions of people calculating survival odds that had nothing to do with official chain of command. They were becoming a mob, individual animals more likely to scatter than hold together, and Sterling couldn't stop the disintegration because he felt the same terror they did. They abandoned the hammock at mid-morning, carrying Peters between them, trying once again to find routes north. But the Everglades had changed overnight in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Channels they'd scouted the previous day were now choked with vegetation that looked weeks old. Hammocks had shifted positions, or perhaps they were simply so disoriented that they couldn't recognize landmarks anymore. The sawgrass seemed taller, denser, more alive with hostile purpose. They struggled forward, making perhaps half a mile in 6 hours, Peter's groans of pain marking their progress like a drumbeat announcing their location to anything that cared to listen. That afternoon, Coleman simply disappeared. One moment he was walking point, testing ground ahead for solid footing. The next moment he was gone. No splash, no scream, no sign of struggle. The man behind him insisted Coleman had been visible, had taken 2 steps forward, then vanished as though the earth had opened and swallowed him. They searched the immediate area frantically, probing water with poles, calling his name, but found nothing. The water where he'd disappeared was only 2 feet deep, tested and confirmed, yet Coleman was simply gone as though he'd never existed. They found him an hour later, purely by accident, when one of the men happened to look up. Coleman's body hung from a cypress tree 20 feet above the water, suspended by ropes woven from plant fiber, positioned so he was barely visible against the grey-brown bark and hanging moss. His eyes were open, his face frozen in an expression of complete confusion, and his neck bore marks, suggesting he'd been strangled before being hauled into the canopy. The logistical impossibility of what they were seeing was almost worse than the death itself. She was a girl, maybe 16 years old, certainly not large or physically powerful by conventional measures. Yet she'd somehow overpowered a grown man, killed him silently while others walked nearby, and lifted his body 20 feet into a tree, using leverage and them to cut Coleman down. But before anyone could volunteer to climb, arrows began striking the water around them. Not aimed to hit, but close enough to send spray across their legs, demonstration shots proving she had them in her sights and could strike any time she chose. They retreated from Coleman's body, leaving him hanging as a grim marker, and the psychological impact was immediate and total. 3 men now, Peters wounded and barely conscious, Sterling clinging to authority nobody respected, and 6 others whose faces showed they were each calculating individual survival chances that had nothing to do with the group. That night, they didn't make camp. They simply collapsed where exhaustion took them, too tired to post guards or build fires or organize defense. They lay in shallow water on a mud bank, barely large enough for 8 bodies, staring up at a sky they couldn't see through the cypress canopy, listening to Peters's labored breathing and the endless sounds of predators moving through darkness. Somewhere in that darkness was a girl who'd transformed from prey to nightmare, who'd used their confidence against them, who'd demonstrated that knowledge of environment was worth more than all their weapons combined. Sterling spoke into the darkness, not addressing his men but speaking to her, knowing she was close enough to hear. "What do you want?" His voice cracked with exhaustion and fear. "You've proven your point. You've killed 3 of us. Let the rest go, and we'll tell everyone to stay out of the Everglades. We'll make sure no one comes looking for runaways here again. Just let us live." The response came from somewhere above them, from the trees, a voice that was young and female and carried across the swamp with perfect clarity. "You came here looking for people who'd done nothing wrong. You came here to drag them back to slavery. You came here believing you owned this land, owned these waters, owned any human being you could catch. I didn't kill 3 of you. The swamp killed them because they didn't belong here. Because they came with weapons instead of knowledge, with hate instead of respect. I just made sure they found what was already waiting for them." "How many more?" Sterling asked, and now his voice was pleading. "How many more have to die before you're satisfied?" Sarah's voice came from a different location now, moving through the canopy as easily as they moved on the ground, maybe more easily. "I'll be satisfied when the last of you walks out of here, understanding what you tried to do, carrying a message that will keep others from making the same mistake. When white men learn that this isn't their land to invade, their people to capture, their world to control. Some of you will deliver that message. The rest will stay here forever, feeding the alligators and becoming part of the swamp that killed them." Silence fell, broken only by Peter's whimpering and the water moving around them. They'd come hunting a runaway girl, and they'd found something they had no framework to understand. A force that used the wilderness itself as a weapon. That had turned their strength into weakness and their numbers into liability. That had proven so completely that predators could become prey, that none of them would ever feel safe in wilderness again, assuming any of them survived long enough to leave. Peters died before sunrise. His wound had developed infection that spread with terrifying speed in the humid conditions, and his body simply gave up fighting. The remaining 7 men stared at his corpse as dawn light filtered through the cypress canopy, understanding that he died from a wound designed to kill slowly, to burden his companions, to force them to carry a dying man through terrain that was difficult enough without extra weight. She'd calculated everything, understood how groups deteriorated under pressure, how wounded members accelerated the collapse of morale and cohesion. Sterling made no attempt to organize burial. They simply left Peters where he lay and continued north, or what they hoped was north. Their compass had stopped working reliably days ago, the needle spinning lazily without settling on any direction, and they'd lost faith in their ability to navigate by sun and stars. The Everglades looked the same in every direction, endless sawgrass and water and cypress, no landmarks that stood out, nothing to orient themselves by, except intuition that had proven consistently wrong. By midday, 2 more men had vanished. One moment there were 7 people struggling through chest-deep water. The next moment there were 5, and the 2 missing men had left no sign of where they'd gone. No splashing, no cries for help, no indication they'd even existed. The remaining 5 stopped moving, stood in the water looking at each other with hollow eyes, understanding that continuing forward meant more disappearances until none of them remained. But stopping meant dying in place, either from exposure or from her next attack, whenever she decided to stop playing and finish them. "We separate," said a man named Morrison, a bounty hunter who'd been tracking runaways for 15 years and had never failed to recover his targets until now. "She can't track all of us if we go different directions. Someone will make it out, get help, come back with a real force. 50 men, 100, enough that she can't pick us off individually." Sterling started to argue, to point out that separation was exactly what she wanted, that isolated targets were easier to eliminate than groups, but he stopped because Morrison was already walking away. Just turned and headed east through the sawgrass, not asking permission or waiting for consensus, making an individual survival decision that acknowledged the group was already dead. 2 other men immediately followed Morrison's example, each choosing different directions, abandoning their companions without discussion or farewell, because sentiment was a luxury that required hope, and hope had died days ago. That left Sterling and 2 others, a surveyor named Wallace and a younger man named Todd, who joined the expedition because he'd wanted adventure and had found more than he could psychologically handle. The 3 of them stood together in the water, watching their former companions disappear into the swamp, understanding that they'd just witnessed the final collapse of organizational structure. They were individuals now, 3 separate people who happened to be occupying the same space, no longer bound by command hierarchy or shared purpose. "We should stay together," Sterling said, trying one last time to assert authority over a situation that had moved beyond anyone's control. 3 men are stronger than 1. 3 men are a bigger target, Wallace replied, his voice flat and emotionless. "She's been hunting us as a group because it's easier. Scattered targets mean she has to choose who to pursue, and maybe someone she doesn't choose will survive." He looked at Sterling with something that might have been pity. "You were a good officer once, probably. But this isn't a battlefield. And she isn't an enemy you were trained to fight. Your tactics don't work here, your experience means nothing, and following you has gotten 6 men killed. I'm done following." Wallace walked north, not running, just steady movement that put distance between himself and the others. Todd looked at Sterling, looked at Wallace's retreating back, and made his own calculation. Youth and speed might be advantages in swamp navigation. Being burdened by an older officer who'd proven he didn't understand this environment was definitely a disadvantage. Todd turned and headed west without saying anything, leaving Sterling completely alone for the first time since entering the Everglades. Jacob Sterling stood in waist-deep water, surrounded by sawgrass and silence, and felt something fundamental break inside him. He'd built his identity on military precision, on the belief that training and discipline could overcome any obstacle, that leadership meant controlling outcomes through force of will. But the Everglades had proven all of that wrong, had shown him that some environments couldn't be controlled, some enemies couldn't be defeated through conventional strength, and some battles were lost before they began because the person who chose the battlefield understood it in ways he never could. He started walking, not north toward the settlement, but south, deeper into the swamp. He didn't know why he made that choice. Perhaps some part of him recognized that escaping was impossible, that she'd simply track him down like she'd tracked the others. Perhaps he wanted to see her face before he died, to understand who had dismantled everything he believed about power and control. Perhaps he just wanted the end to come quickly rather than slowly, to die confronting his fear rather than running from it. He found her waiting on a hammock 3 hours later. She sat on a fallen cypress log, her bow across her knees, watching him approach with the same calm assessment he'd seen in her silhouette days earlier. Up close, she looked even younger than he'd imagined. A girl who should have been learning domestic skills or preparing for marriage, not hunting grown men through wilderness that killed professionals regularly. But her eyes were ancient, carrying knowledge accumulated over 16 years of learning to survive in an environment that offered no mercy to mistakes. Sterling stopped 10 feet away, close enough to see the details of her face, the patterns drawn in plant dye on her cheeks, the scars on her hands from years of work that white women would never experience. He was still armed, could have raised his rifle and fired, but he understood with absolute certainty that he wouldn't get the shot off before she buried an arrow in his chest. And more importantly, shooting her wouldn't change anything. The Everglades would still be here, still hostile to people who entered without understanding, and his death would still come from the environment rather than her violence. "They'll send more," he said finally, his voice hoarse from days of shouting and fear. "When we don't return, they'll organize a real expedition. 50 men, 100, people who know how to fight in swamps. You can't kill everyone." Sarah studied him silently for a moment, then spoke with the confidence of someone stating simple facts rather than making threats. "Let them come. I know this swamp better than I know my own heartbeat. Every channel, every gator hole, every plant that feeds and every plant that poisons. I was raised here, this is my home, and you're trespassing in someone's home who knows exactly how to defend it. Your soldiers will die like you've died. Not from me, but from their own ignorance. From drinking water that carries disease, from stepping on snakes they didn't see, from wandering into deep channels they thought were shallow. I don't need to kill anyone, I just need to make sure they encounter everything that's already waiting to kill them." "Then kill me now," Sterling said, and he was surprised to realize he meant it. Living with the knowledge of his complete failure was worse than death. Returning to civilization as the officer who'd lost 8 men to a teenage girl was unthinkable. Better to die here, become another cautionary tale, than survive to face the questions and accusations that would follow. But Sarah shook her head slowly. "No. You're going to walk out of here. You're going to be the one who carries the message, who tells every slave catcher and bounty hunter and expedition organizer what happens when they come looking for runaways in the deep Everglades. You're going to spend the rest of your life remembering that a black girl you dismissed as property understood this wilderness better than you'll ever understand anything. And every time you close your eyes, you'll see your men dying because you led them somewhere you didn't belong." She stood, gestured north with her bow, and her voice carried an edge that made clear this was not mercy, but calculated cruelty. "Walk," Follow the channel that runs northwest from here. Stay in the water where it's knee-deep or less. Avoid the hammocks with the red flowers. They're surrounded by cottonmouths. When you reach the fork where water splits 3 directions, take the leftmost channel. It will bring you to the settlement boundary in 2 days, if you don't stop to rest, and if you're lucky enough not to meet any gators who've decided you look like food. Sterling started to ask you live because dead men don't talk. But the others? Morrison went east into territory where the water's too deep and the gators are too thick. He's already dead, probably, or will be soon. Wallace went north into channels that flood this time of year. He'll drown when the waters rise tonight. Todd went west where the snakes congregate, and he's young and fast and stupid enough to run right into them. 3 more graves that the swamp will dig without me lifting a finger. You're the survivor I've chosen because you have rank, because people will listen when you tell them what happened here. The others were just numbers. You're the message. She stepped back into the sawgrass and vanished with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent her life moving through this terrain. Sterling stood alone on the hammock, processing the fact that she'd just given him detailed directions to safety after killing or orchestrating the deaths of 8 men. The psychological complexity of that choice was beyond his capacity to understand. She could have killed him easily, but she'd chosen to let him live with the burden of survival, to carry trauma and guilt and the certainty of his own inadequacy for however many years remained to him. He followed her directions because he had no other options. Walked through water that came to his knees, avoided the hammocks she'd warned about, took the left channel at the fork. 2 days of stumbling forward in a haze of exhaustion and dehydration and growing fever from God knows what disease he'd contracted, drinking swamp water. On the morning of the 3rd day, he saw structures through the trees, buildings that meant civilization, and he crawled the last 100 yards because his legs wouldn't hold him anymore. The settlement doctors treated him for dehydration, infection, exposure, and what they diplomatically termed nervous exhaustion. He remained in their care for 3 weeks, recovering physically while his mental state deteriorated. He had nightmares every time he slept, waking up screaming about sawgrass, closing in and arrows flying from darkness, and a girl's voice explaining in perfect detail how his men would die. When he was finally coherent enough to give testimony to the sheriff, his story was so disturbing that officials initially considered he might be suffering from fever-induced delusions. But Morrison's body was found 2 weeks later by Seminole traders, exactly where Sarah had predicted, in deep water surrounded by alligators that had been feeding on the corpse. Wallace's body washed up on the settlement boundary during the seasonal flooding, drowned in channels that rose faster than he could escape. Todd was discovered by a survey crew 6 weeks later, dead from snake bites, dozens of puncture wounds, suggesting he'd stumbled into a cottonmouth nest and been bitten repeatedly before he could extract himself. The bodies confirmed Sterling's testimony, but they also confirmed something more disturbing. Sarah had known exactly where each man would die, had predicted their fates with accuracy that suggested she understood not just the terrain, but human psychology well enough to anticipate which direction each man would choose when they scattered. She'd herded them like livestock, given them the illusion of choice, while ensuring every choice led to death except the one she'd permitted Sterling to make. Monroe County never organized another expedition into the deep Everglades. The official policy became one of strategic neglect, acknowledging that runaways who fled into the swamps were beyond recovery and not worth the cost in men and resources to pursue. Slave catchers working the region began refusing contracts that required entering territory south of the settlement line, and the few who accepted such work charged fees so exorbitant that plantation owners generally decided to write off the lost property rather than pay. Stories about Sarah spread through the enslaved population across Florida and into Georgia and the Carolinas. The details varied wildly. Some versions had her commanding alligators and snakes. Others suggested she could transform into animals herself. A few claimed she was actually the spirit of the Everglades, given human form to punish invaders. But they all carried the same essential truth. A black girl had made the swamp her fortress, had defeated every attempt to capture her, and had proven that freedom could be taken and defended if you understood the land well enough to make it your ally. For runaways planning escapes, the stories provided both hope and practical knowledge. If you could reach the deep Everglades, if you could learn to survive its dangers, you could be free in ways that weren't possible anywhere else in the South. The swamp became a destination rather than a death trap, a place where the usual rules didn't apply because someone had rewritten those rules using knowledge the slaveholder class didn't possess. Abolitionists in the North heard the stories and included them in their speeches and publications, though they often sanitized the violence and made Sarah into a more conventional hero than she actually was. They talked about her courage and survival skills, but glossed over the calculated deaths she'd orchestrated, the psychological warfare she'd employed, the fact that she'd let men die slowly when she could have killed them quickly. The full truth was more complex and darker than simple heroism, revealing someone who'd been shaped by trauma and environment into something that existed outside normal moral categories. She wasn't a hero or a villain. She was a survivor who'd learned that in certain environments, the only way to survive was to become more dangerous than the dangers surrounding you. Jacob Sterling died in 1862, 7 years after emerging from the Everglades. He'd never returned to military or law enforcement work, had lived as a recluse on the edge of the settlement, drinking heavily and avoiding human contact whenever possible. His obituary mentioned his service during the Seminole Wars, but made no reference to the 1,855 expedition that had destroyed him psychologically. People who'd known him reported that he talked to himself constantly, carrying on conversations with people who weren't there, arguing with ghosts who died in the swamp under his command. The actual fate of Sarah after 1857 is unknown and contested. Some accounts claim she remained in the Everglades until her death, living alone or with a small community of other runaways, becoming a legend that protected that territory for decades. Others suggest she eventually moved farther south into the Keys or even to the Bahamas, where escaped slaves established settlements beyond American reach. A few testimonies from formerly enslaved people interviewed after the Civil War mentioned encountering a woman matching her description in the Everglades during the 1,860 seconds, still living in the deep swamp, still helping runaways navigate to safety. What is documented without dispute is that between 1,855 and 1,860, 23 and 1,860, 23 men entered the Everglades on various attempts to locate and capture her, and not one returned alive. The pattern was consistent across all the expeditions. Men would enter the swamp with confidence and superior weapons. Days would pass with no word. Eventually bodies would be found, if they were found at all, dead from environmental causes that somehow always occurred in ways that suggested guidance rather than accident. Drowning in channels that appeared after seasonal floods. Snake bites from areas known to be dangerous. Alligator attacks in locations where the reptiles typically congregated. Heat stroke and dehydration despite carrying adequate water supplies that somehow became contaminated. The statistical impossibility of 23 men all dying from natural causes while pursuing the same target wasn't lost on anyone, but officially acknowledging that a black teenage girl was systematically killing white men was politically unacceptable. So the deaths were recorded as individual tragedies, unfortunate accidents that occurred in dangerous territory, with no connection between them except the unfortunate coincidence that they all happened while searching for the same runaway. The Everglades remained dangerous territory throughout the antebellum period and into the 20th century, but the nature of that danger evolved in public consciousness. It wasn't just wilderness anymore, it was specifically wilderness that had been claimed by people who refused to be enslaved, who'd learned to weaponize the environment itself, who'd proven that knowledge of terrain could defeat any conventional force. The swamp became a symbol of resistance, a physical manifestation of the idea that some people and some places couldn't be controlled, no matter how much violence the controlling power was willing to employ. Modern historians studying the period have tried to separate fact from folklore to determine what Sarah actually did versus what mythology attributed to her. The task is nearly impossible because the enslaved population who preserved her story had every reason to embellish and exaggerate, turning a real person into a larger-than-life figure who represented everything they hoped resistance could achieve. The white population who documented the deaths had every reason to minimize and explain away, turning systematic guerrilla warfare into a series of unrelated accidents because acknowledging the truth meant acknowledging that their power had limits. What survives in the documentary record are the bodies, the death certificates, the expedition reports that list men as lost in the Everglades between 1,855 and 1,860. What survives in oral history are the stories passed down through generations of black families, stories about a girl who made the swamp her weapon, who studied her enemies until she could predict their every move, who understood that the best way to fight people with superior resources was to let the environment do the fighting for you. Whether Sarah killed those 23 men directly or simply ensured they encountered dangers that would have killed them anyway is ultimately a distinction without much difference. She was the architect of their destruction either way, the intelligence that guided them toward their graves. The symbols she carved in trees, the same symbols Sterling and his men found, have been studied by anthropologists who identified them as a mixture of Seminole marking systems and West African Nisibidi, a symbolic writing used by secret societies. The combination suggests Sarah was doing something more sophisticated than simple territory marking. She was creating a written record in languages white men couldn't read, documenting their invasion of her space, their deaths, their failure. The trees themselves became archives, storing information in a form that would persist for decades, readable only by people who'd learned the symbolic languages of resistance. Some of those marked trees still exist in protected areas of the Everglades, though the carvings have weathered and become harder to decipher. Rangers working the territory report that certain sections of the swamp still feel hostile in ways that aren't entirely explicable through natural features. Places where compasses behave strangely, where experienced guides become disoriented, where people report feeling watched by something that understands the terrain better than they ever could. Are these actual lingering traces of Sarah's presence, or simply psychological responses to knowing what happened in those locations? The answer probably depends on whether you believe knowledge and trauma can imprint on landscape, or whether wilderness is just wilderness regardless of human events that occurred there. What's undeniable is that Sarah's story, whether embellished or accurate in every detail, accomplished something remarkable. It provided a counter-narrative to the standard stories of slavery and resistance, showing that victory didn't require conventional military force or widespread uprising. Sometimes victory meant making yourself so dangerous in a specific territory that invaders learned to avoid that territory entirely. Sometimes power meant knowing your environment so completely that you could use it as both shield and sword. And sometimes the most effective resistance was psychological, breaking the enemy's will rather than their body, making them too afraid to return even if they survived the first encounter. If you've found this story as compelling as I have researching it, this is exactly the kind of buried history we explore here on The Sealed Room. The narratives that got erased or distorted because they challenged fundamental assumptions about power and control. We dig into the archives, examine the folklore, and try to understand what really happened when official records and oral histories tell completely different stories. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss future investigations into America's darkest and most deliberately forgotten chapters. And I have to ask, what do you think happened in those Everglades? Do you believe Sarah was really responsible for all 23 deaths? Or were some just unfortunate accidents that got attributed to her after the fact? Do you think she survived into old age somewhere in the swamp, or did the environment eventually claim her like it claimed so many others? More fundamentally, where's the line between justified resistance and murder when you're fighting a system that considers you property? These are questions without easy answers, and I want to hear your perspectives in the comments below. Think about what it means that a teenage girl with no formal military training managed to defeat multiple armed expeditions through nothing but superior knowledge of terrain and understanding of human psychology. Think about how that challenges our assumptions about what makes someone powerful or dangerous. And think about how many other stories like this might exist, buried in archives or preserved only in oral traditions, waiting for someone to examine them seriously rather than dismissing them as folklore. The Everglades keep their secrets well, but sometimes those secrets leak out in